The Second Crusade. It had long been apparent that Edessa was vulnerable, but its loss came as a shock to Eastern and Western Christians. Urgent pleas for aid soon reached Europe, and in 1145 Pope Eugenius III issued a formal crusade bull, Quantum Predecessors. It was the first of its kind, with precisely worded provisions designed to protect crusaders' families and property and reflecting contemporary advances in canon law. The crusade was preached by Saint Bernard in France and, with the aid of interpreters, even in Germany. Bernard revolutionized crusade ideology, asserting that the crusade was not merely an act of charity or a war to secure holy places but a means of redemption. In his mercy, Christ offered the warriors of Europe a blessed avenue of salvation, a means by which they could give up all they had to follow him. As in the First Crusade, many simple pilgrims responded. Unlike the First Crusade, however, the Second Crusade was led by two of Europe's greatest rulers, King Louis VII of France and Emperor Conrad III of Germany. Louis enthusiastically supported the crusade, but Conrad was reluctant at first and was won over only by the eloquence of Saint Bernard. The Second Crusade also differed from its predecessor in that there were three objectives instead of one. While the kings of Germany and France marched east to restore Edessa, other crusaders went to Spain to fight Muslims or to the shores of the Baltic Sea to fight the pagan Wends. The situation in the east was also different. Manuel Comnenus, the Byzantine emperor, was not pleased to discover another crusade headed toward Constantinople. The Second Crusade wreaked havoc with his foreign policy, which included an alliance with Germany, Venice, and the Pope against the Normans. It also complicated the emperor's peaceful relationship with the Turkish Sultan of Rum. Manuel made a truce with the Sultan in 1146 to make certain that the crusade would not cause the Sultan to attack Byzantine lands in Asia. Although sound strategically, the emperor's move confirmed for many Western Christians the apostasy of the Greeks. Conrad left in May 1147, accompanied by many German nobles, the kings of Poland and Bohemia, and his nephew, the future Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. Conrad's poorly disciplined troops created tension in Constantinople, where they arrived in September. Conrad and Manuel, however, remained on good terms, and both were apprehensive about the moves of King Roger II of Sicily, who during these same weeks seized Corfu and attacked the Greek mainland. Conrad, rejecting Manuel's advice to follow the coastal route around Asia Minor, moved his main force past Nicaea directly into Anatolia. On October 25 at Dorylaeum, not far from where the First Crusaders won their victory, his army, weary and without adequate provisions, was set upon by the Turks and virtually destroyed. Conrad, with a few survivors, retreated to Nicaea. Louis VII, accompanied by his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, followed the land route across Europe and arrived at Constantinople on October 4, about a month after the Germans. A few of his more hot-headed followers, on hearing that Manuel had made a truce with the Turks of Iconium and totally misunderstanding his motives, accused the emperor of treason and urged the French king to join Roger in attacking the Byzantines. Louis preferred the opinion of his less volatile advisers and agreed to restore any imperial possessions he might capture. In November the French reached Nicaea, where they learned of Conrad's defeat. Louis and Conrad then started along the coastal route, with the French now in the vanguard, and reached Ephesus. Conrad became seriously ill and returned to Constantinople to the medical ministrations of Manuel. After recuperating, he eventually reached Acre by ship in April 1148. The French passage from Ephesus to Antioch in midwinter was extremely harrowing. supplies ran short, and the Byzantines were unjustly blamed. Manuel defended his cities against the angry Crusaders, which meant that the French spent more energy fighting Christians than Muslims. Louis concluded that the Greeks were trying to weaken the crusade. He also had lost the bulk of his troops to Turkish attacks by the time he reached Antioch, which was ruled by Eleanor's uncle, Prince Raymond. The Crusade's original goal of recapturing Idasa was no longer feasible, because Nur al-Din, the son and successor of Zangi, made it difficult to take and hold Idasa with the forces available. Raymond urged an attack on Aleppo, Nur al-Din's center of power. But King Louis, who resented Eleanor's open espousal of Raymond's project, left abruptly for Jerusalem and forced the Queen to join him. In Jerusalem, where Conrad had already arrived, many French and German notables assembled with Queen Melisende, her son Baldwin III, and the barons of Jerusalem to discuss how best to proceed. Despite the absence of the northern princes and the losses already suffered by the Crusaders, it was possible to field an army of nearly 50,000 men, the largest crusade army so far assembled. After considerable debate, which revealed the conflicting purposes of Crusaders and Jerusalem barons, it was decided to attack Damascus. How the decision was reached is not known. Damascus was undoubtedly a tempting prize. Its ruler, Anwar, fearful of the expanding power of Nur al-Din, was the one Muslim ruler most disposed to cooperating with the Franks. However, Anwar was now forced to seek the aid of his former enemy to thwart them. And Nur al-Din was not slow to move toward Damascus. Not only was the Crusader campaign poorly conceived, but it was badly executed. On July 28, after a 4-day siege, with Nur al-Din's forces nearing the city, it became evident that the Crusader army was dangerously exposed, and a retreat was ordered, while Nur al-Din succeeded in strengthening the unified Muslim response to the Western invaders. It was a humiliating failure, attributable largely to the conflicting interests of the participants. Conrad decamped for Constantinople, where he agreed to join the emperor against Roger of Sicily. Louis's reaction was different. His resentment against Manuel, whom he blamed for the failure, was so great that he accepted Roger's offer of ships to take him home and agreed to a plan for a new crusade against Byzantium. Lacking papal support, the plan came to nothing, but the perception that the Byzantines were part of the problem rather than the solution became widespread in Europe. The Second Crusade had been promoted with great zeal and had aroused high hopes. Its collapse caused deep dismay. Searching for an explanation, St. Bernard turned to Scripture and preached that the crusade failed because of the sinfulness of Europe. Only through the purification and prayers of Christian men and women would God relent and bestow victory on his knights once more. This belief became central to crusading ideology and an important impetus for movements of lay piety during the Middle Ages. The Muslims, on the other hand, were enormously encouraged by the collapse of the Second Crusade because they had confronted the danger of another major Western expedition and had triumphed. During the 25 years following the Second Crusade, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was governed by two of its ablest rulers. Baldwin III, reigned 1143–62, and Amalrikai, 1163–74. In 1153 King Baldwin captured Ascalon, extending the kingdom's coastline southward, though this would be the Franks' last major conquest. Its possession was offset the next year by the occupation of Damascus by Nur al-Din, one more stage in the encirclement of the Crusader states by a single Muslim power. In 1161 the possibility that the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, shaken by palace intrigues and assassinations, might collapse under the influence of Muslim Syria caused anxiety in Jerusalem. Thus, in 1164, when Nur al-Din sent his lieutenant Shirkuh to Egypt accompanied by his own nephew, Saladin, King Amalric decided to intervene. After some maneuvering, the armies of both Amalric and Shirkuh withdrew, as they were to do again 3 years later. Meanwhile, Amalric, realizing the necessity of Byzantine cooperation, had sent Archbishop William of Tyre as an envoy to Constantinople. In 1168, before the news of the agreement that William of Tyre had arranged reached Jerusalem, the king, for reasons unknown, set out for Egypt. The venture failed, and Shirkuh entered Cairo. Saladin, then Nur al-Din's deputy, was left to overcome the remaining opposition and assume control of Egypt. In 1171 Saladin have the prayers in the mosques mention the Caliph of Baghdad instead of the Caliph of Cairo, whose health was failing. Thus ended the Fatimid Caliphate and the great division in Levantine Islam from which the Latins had profited. Ominous developments followed the deaths of both Amalric and Nur al-Din in 1174. In 1176 the Seljuks of Iconium defeated the armies of Emperor Manuel Comnenus at Myriosephalon. When Manuel died in 1180, all hope of effective Byzantine-Latin cooperation vanished. 3 years later Saladin occupied Aleppo, virtually completing the encirclement of the Latin states. In 1185 he agreed to a truce and left for Egypt. In Jerusalem Amalric was succeeded by his son Baldwin IV, a 13-year-old boy suffering from leprosy. Despite the young king's extraordinary fortitude, his precarious health necessitated continuous regencies and created a problem of succession until his sister Sybil bore a son, the future Baldwin V, to William of Montferrat. Her subsequent marriage in 1180 to Guy of Lusignan, a newcomer to the east and brother of Amalric, accentuated existing rivalries between the barons. In addition to these internal problems, the kingdom was the most isolated ever. Urgent appeals to the West and the efforts of Pope Alexander III had brought little response. Baldwin IV died in March 1185, leaving, according to previous agreement, Raymond of Tripoli as regent for the child King Baldwin V. But when Baldwin V died in 1186, the court party outmaneuvered the other barons and, disregarding succession arrangements that had been formally drawn up, hastily crowned Sybil. She in turn crowned her husband, Guy of Lusignan. In the midst of near civil war, Reginald of Chatillon, Lord of Kerak, broke the truce with the Muslims by attacking a caravan. Saladin replied by proclaiming jihad against the Latin kingdom. In 1187 he left Egypt, crossed the Jordan south of the Sea of Galilee, and took up a position close to the river. Near Sepphoris the Crusaders mobilized an army of perhaps 20,000 men, which included some 1,200 heavily armed cavalry. In a spot well chosen and adequately supplied with water and provisions, they waited for Saladin, who, by some estimates, had about 30,000 men, half of whom were light cavalry, to make the first move. On July 2 Saladin blocked the main road to Tiberias and sent a small force to attack the town, hoping that Count Raymond's wife's presence there would lure crusaders into the open. It was Raymond, however, who initially persuaded the king not to fall into the trap. But, late that night, others, accusing the count of treason, prevailed upon the king to change his mind. This fateful decision would lead to the destruction of the Crusader army. On July 3 the Crusaders undertook an exhausting day's march, spent a terrible night without water, and were surrounded and constantly harassed. The following day they faced Saladin's forces at the Horns of Hattin and fought throughout the day, with smoke from grass fires set by the enemy pouring into their faces. When the infantry broke ranks, the essential coordination with the cavalry was shattered, and the Crusaders' fate was sealed. By the time Saladin's final charge ended the battle, most of the knights had been slain or captured. The king's life was spared, but Saladin killed Reginald of Chatillon and ordered the execution of some 200 Templars and hospiters. Other captive knights were treated honorably, and most were later ransomed. Less fortunate were the foot soldiers, most of whom were sold into slavery. Virtually the entire military force of the Kingdom of Jerusalem had been destroyed. To make matters worse, Saladin captured the relic of the True Cross, which he sent to Damascus, where it was paraded through the streets upside down. Saladin quickly followed up his victory in the Battle of Hattin by taking Tiberias and moving toward the coast to seize Acre, Akko. By September 1187 he and his lieutenants had occupied most of the major strongholds in the kingdom and all the ports south of Tripoli in the kingdom. On October 2, Jerusalem, then defended by only a handful of men under the command of Balian of Ibelin, capitulated to Saladin, who agreed to allow the inhabitants to leave once they had paid a ransom. Though Saladin's offer included the poor, several thousand apparently were not redeemed and probably were sold into slavery. In Jerusalem, as in most of the cities captured, those who stayed were Syrian or Greek Christians. Somewhat later Saladin permitted a number of Jews to settle in the city. Meanwhile, Saladin continued his conquests in the north, and by 1189 the entire kingdom was in his hands except Belvoia and Tyre. The county of Tripoli and the Principality of Antioch were each reduced to the capital city and a few outposts. The majority of the 100-year-old Latin establishment in the Levant had been lost.